so I think we could begin. I wanted to welcome everybody back to the Fifth Avenue Synagogue Sunday evening discussion and lecture series. Tonight, we once again have the opportunity to hear from Mr. Michael Steinhardt, who's well-known for many, many different areas. In the Jewish world, he's the most well-known for co-founding Birthright, which is a program that takes Jews around the world to the land of Israel. How many people have gone so far, right? When I used to go to Israel, on back of the buses, they would have the number. And last time I saw it was 600,000-700,000. I'm sure.
Yeah,
where are they at now?
It's between 700,000 and 800,000.
So, okay. So we're coming close to the million mark. And it's a way of instilling Jewish pride to the masses, and a way of engaging and connecting Jews to the land of Israel. Something needed to be done, and it was definitely an out-of-the-box creative idea that has made a major impact upon the Jewish world. We're going to hear this evening Michael speak a little bit about his new book entitled Jewish Pride. And to formally introduce him and to conduct the interview is the Fifth Avenue Synagogue Honorary President, Ezra Merkin. I wanted to use this opportunity to thank Ezra for being instrumental in arranging these Sunday speaker series. There's a lot of effort and a lot of coordination that takes place behind the scenes to arrange these discussions. So I want to formally thank Ezra. And of course, we have to thank Ezra and Lauren on a broader sense for playing such an integral role in the leadership of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue for so many years and decades. They are one of the principal families behind the current renovations. And I was just in the main shul just a couple of minutes ago, and all the pews are in, and we're almost at the end. We see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we want to thank them for their commitment to renew the building for a bright future, please God. And we also want to thank them for the years of leadership. The Merkin family has been there since the very inception of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue, and we hope and pray and bless them that they should always have good health and joy from the wonderful family, and continue to have the opportunity to engage and enhance and improve the quality of life and the spiritual life of Jewish people for years to come. So I'd like to call upon Ezra to begin and introduce this evening's program.
Thank you, Rabbi Babbage, not only for the introduction of Michael, but the introduction of me as well, which wasn't necessarily something I was expecting. We expect to hear this evening not only from Michael, but from a pride of Steinhardt's, Michael, his daughter Sara, and his son David. And they have gathered with us in part as a pride of Steinhardt's to discuss Jewish Pride, Michael's new book, the book and its concept. In introducing Michael, I thought that one of the many things that Michael can take enormous pride in is his capacity for friendship and his capacity for loyalty extended to friends. I can testify directly to that. In the long course of a friendship with Michael, it has probably entered its fourth decade. And I thought a little bit about the rabbinic teaching that says, Kol Yisrael arivin ze lezeh, all Jews are responsible for each other. And think of that as the other side of the coin that enables Jewish pride. The sense of mutual responsibility is what permits Jews to take so much pride in each other and in communal accomplishments. Arevin is an interesting word in the world of Talmudic finance. Eravon means surety, collateral. It refers to often a garment that acts as collateral or surety on a loan. Kol Yisrael arevin ze lezeh might be understood to mean that all Jews are pledged, all Jews are cross-collateralized, as Michael might see it in his world of finance. And in contemporary Hebrew, the word be'eravon mugbal is the legal word that conveys limited liability. That's how one expresses the limited liability that attends a corporation. Michael, I think, not only tolerates no bull, he tolerates no limited liability when it comes to Jewish cross-collateralization. There's eravon maleh, full responsibility, perhaps testified to as much as anything else by birthright. So tonight we'll speak to the author of No Bull and Jewish Pride, Michael H. Steinhardt. And just before we do, I wanted to ask David to introduce his sister, Sarah, and Sarah to introduce her brother, David.
Oh, thanks, Ezra. My sister, Sarah, is, I guess, very much like Ezra's introduction of Michael, someone who has great capacity for loyalty and friendship. And Sarah is a mother of 6 amazing kids who are my nieces and nephews. Sarah also has a bunch of dogs and even a pet pig, I think. Sarah, do you still have the pet pig at home?
Not quite in the city, but yes, she still lives on.
And Sarah has been very involved in our father's philanthropy for quite a long time. She has been, I think, part of his foundation, our foundation, a chief advocate for all of his projects. Sarah is, when I think of which project in particular, Sarah is, I don't know if you're the founder, Sarah, but I know you're the head of the board of the Charter School Network, and that's the one that I sort of associate you most with. But that's Sarah, someone who has been a wonderful sister and a great friend to her friends. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much. And David and I are lucky to love each other so much and have a real mutual respect and also just an easy, wonderful friendship. And David is also, I'd say the best thing David did this year is have a 4th child, Simon, who's 6 months old, but he has 4 kids and we live near each other. And he's an investor in lots of different interesting things, so which I know very little about. Sometimes they include banks, sometimes they include hotels. And he started Natan, and sometimes I admire him. He goes out and does his own interesting things, but Natan's been, was a giving circle for young Jews to engage in philanthropy long before the term giving circle became a little more popular like it is today. And I would say that of the 2 siblings, I might be the chattier, but David's always the wiser. He says less, but what he says should be paid attention to more.
Terrific. Thank you very much for those introductions. They're great. I wanted to start by asking David and Sarah, David, doesn't matter. And partly as a way of getting the book in front of our audience, what do you think is the thesis of the book Jewish Pride? What does Jewish Pride stand for, in your opinion, to Michael? And what does it mean if it means something a little bit different, or if in fact it means something that is very much the same to you? Meaning, what is the thesis of the book? What is Jewish Pride? What role does it occupy in your father's thought and activity? And how does that concept apply to you? And how does it apply to perhaps the next generation? Does Jewish Pride abide? Is it effective? Does it go down generations? How does it sort itself out? So David or Sarah, whoever wants to start, happy to listen.
You go first.
All right, that's a lot of questions, so I'll just start.
Yeah, it's all one theme. You can pick any one of those you want.
Maybe David will chime in, but I think the book is—
And so might Michael.
And so might Michael. Jewish Pride is an exploration, I think, aimed at at least 85% of American Jews who aren't connected as deeply into Jewish life as certainly my father wants them to be. I think those Jews feel, and the Pew study shows, they feel a sense of pride. But I think the question that you even raise in your question is, what does that transfer to the next generation? And I think I'll dangle a few sort of, not spoiler alerts, but wonderful suggestions that you know, our established Jewish communal world hasn't been terribly creative in engaging those 85%. The rabbi mentioned Birthright, and I think my father's certainly known for Birthright, which was really a creative attempt at rethinking about how we might engage young Jews in their 20s and 30s who know very little about Jewish life and are poorly Jewish educated. And then the question is, what else could we do now? The book wonders and ponders and explores, for example, one idea, one thesis of the book is that instead of the American Jewish community always wondering how we can buy an ambulance for Israel or buy trees in Israel and support Israel, how might we think about this relationship differently? How might the Israeli Jews think about supporting American Jews who need to be inspired by Israeli culture, chutzpah, language? So that's an important thesis that the book offers. David.
Yeah, I you know, thinking about this evening, one, and it's not really addressing your question, Ezra, but it makes me wonder if, and it's a question to my father, is he an optimist or pessimist? And I think a lot of the book sort of weaves back and forth between his life growing up and how he became inspired to care so much about being Jewish, and then sort of some of the programs that he created along the way. It sort of goes back and forth about that. And then I was just sort of looking at the book again just before tonight and sort of wondering, knowing him, because if you were to ask me, is Michael an optimist or pessimist generally, I would say pessimist. That's more his personality. I think pessimism sort of has helped him in his life in business. Maybe it's pessimism, maybe it's skepticism. But part of the book sort of goes back and forth on this. There are glimmers of optimism, and it just got me wondering and thinking myself. It's something that I would be curious to know about. You know, if there was a question from you, Ezra, are you an optimist or pessimist, Michael? And you know, that could be about life in general, or it could be about Jewish future.
That's a great question, Michael.
If asked the question baldly, I would say pessimist. That's been my thing. I don't think there's anybody, or almost no one, for instance, in the stock market who has had the negative views and the negative portfolios that I've had through most of my career. Now, that's a whole different thing than the Jewish world, but it's not exactly unrelated. So I tend to think about the things that can harm us and the things that are negative and the things we should fear much more than any optimistic sense I might have, and I sometimes have optimistic sense about the future, but it's more pessimistic. It's more maybe picking up on Jewish history and all the bad things that have happened to us over the years, and it's much easier to focus on the bad things and the disappointments and the tragedies than on the successes. And frankly, the successes I find tend to be in the more secular areas, in the non-religious areas of Jewish life. And there one can be a little bit optimistic because we've achieved so much in our secular world. We've achieved so much as Jewish Americans, for instance. And that gets me thinking about why we Jews might be more optimistic than we have historically been. But again, there are plenty of reasons to be pessimistic. You can start with the 10th century in England, or you can start earlier, you can start with the Inquisition, with the Holocaust. It goes on and on and on and on and on. And the optimism, at least the optimism that I know, more than anything else, is a 20th, 21st century phenomenon. And I think that there's reason to be optimistic about the future, but it's filled with qualms and filled with uncertainty and filled with with assumptions as to where the Jewish people are going from here in light of all the tourists we have experienced and continue to experience.
So as you, I have some idea of the range, the ages of your grandchildren, but Sarah and David will tell me what that range is. Sarah, do you just
So
from
the oldest
from-
is 24 and the youngest is 6 months.
I was going to guess 25 to 6 months. As you talk to your grandchildren, as you help in the process of raising grandchildren and educating them, and as you draw on your experiences growing up, and as you recognize the extraordinary difference in growing up between you and your children, and the perhaps less extraordinary difference in growing up between your children and your grandchildren, and I may be wrong about that, that's for you to say. How do you draw on the positives, and how do you overcome, I very much agree with David, how do you overcome your skepticism? Forget the stock market for the moment, although be interested in that at some point, but how do you turn it constructive? And how do you take Jewish pride in terms of what it meant to you and instill it in the next generations?
Well, that question is one of the major questions that I face and think about all the time. I mean, one can say that, using an extreme example, that Sandy Koufax was a great Jewish ball player, and he didn't play on Yom Kippur as a token of faith in his otherwise secular Jewish life. Well, what does that mean? Is that an optimistic statement, a pessimistic statement? I'm not exactly sure. But in the secular Jewish world, there are innumerable examples of great optimistic achievement. I recently read a book that was given me by a South African philanthropist. And it's a book about English secular Jews and their accomplishments. And I think we would all be astonished by what English secular Jews have done in England and in the world and in areas of science and technology and literature. It is absolutely astonishing. But if I were to ask most of the world's 17 or 18 million Jews today to tell me about the accomplishments of the English Jewish secular world, I think they would really strain to come up with much. Now, what's the conclusion from that? I'm not sure. I'm not sure, except to say that Jews per se have a great deal to be thankful for and a great deal that they have accomplished in areas that even we on this Zoom call don't have the foggiest idea about. So I think it's worthwhile to remember that we Jews have a long history of achievement. That history, I think, is overwhelmingly concretized in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. And that's a wonderful thing.
It surely is, but I just want to press a little bit. Does that sense of wonder, that genuine sense of wonder at these accomplishments, play a role in shaping Jewish identity for another generation?
I certainly hope so.
I-
I certainly
I
think so.
certainly hope so too, but I'm saying, as you think about these issues, are there systems, techniques, schoolings, educations that push that forward, and how does one do that? That is, how does one address this extraordinarily accomplished Jewish world that for the moment, let's say, is non-theist based at all, and raise identified Jews who have a legitimate and abiding sense of Jewish identity that can be passed down to another generation? What I'm suggesting to some extent, and I hadn't thought about this as I began the question, is the Steinhardts are a little bit of sort of, they're the laboratory for this. You are, your children are, your grandchildren are. And I just wonder, what the reports are like coming from this, I'd say, quite different, very deliberate sense of self-aware identity that is being asked to do so much in terms of the next generations.
Well,
We don't have to have the answers to all these questions. They don't have to be all threshed out. I'm just curious to see what the current thinking is.
firstly, I appreciate your calling our family a laboratory for the next generations. It's an interesting thought. But there are many, many, many Jews who truly are laboratories for the next generation. After seeing the Yiddish version of Fiddler on the Roof for the second time.
I've seen it twice also.
Have you? Yeah.
I've loved it. Yeah.
I loved it too. And it somehow was a magical, I'll use your word, laboratory for what Jews were and are and what they might become. And it's not a static world. It's a dramatically changing world.
Very dynamic.
And it is ultimately a secular Jewish world. And I can't but acknowledge that the fact that the religion, our religion, is failing, in my view, most Jews in the world. And that bothers me, but I don't see an alternative to that occurrence as I look forward.
So let's just talk about that a little bit. One of the things that I loved about the book were the photographs. I thought they were terrific. I thought some of the pictures of young David Steinhardt were absolutely great. But the photograph of this framed, I don't know exactly what shape it takes, saying that's on a wall in your office that says, I am an atheist, thank God, is, I think, the ironic sense of you, which is, I think, part of the resolution of your skepticism, is that even about your skepticism, you can't help but be ironic about. And so my question to you is, what does the Orthodox world, or for that matter, any deist-based part of Jewish communal life, mean to you today? Meaning, how important is its continued existence? What does it mean for, let's just call it the Jewish pride approach to life? What are the things that you find sustaining about it? And what are the things that you think are significantly lacking?
I'm very numbers oriented, and with that as background, I'm always struck by the fact that the Orthodox community, say in America, hasn't grown very much. You would think it would have grown in light of the fact that its degree of intermarriage is minimal compared with the rest of us. It is has much higher birth rate excuse me, than the rest of us. And yet it's not growing as much as one might have thought. So I asked the question, how could that be? Why isn't the Orthodox world dominating the Jewish future? And it's not. And I have a few weak answers to that question. One of which is that, that the Orthodox are not remaining Orthodox to the degree that would allow them to show the growth that their birth rate and their lack of intermarriage might suggest. So there must be a substantial, unarticulated number of Orthodox who are leaving Orthodoxy. And I'm not sure I'm happy or unhappy about that, but it's the only way to explain the fact that the Orthodox amongst us are not growing.
But
Not
it's,
so
it's hard not to chime in and sort of press you a little bit about the fact that you love the Orthodox. It's all over Jewish pride. It's all over your face when, you know, I think, Ezra, you know, my kids have gone to Ramaz,
Sure.
Orthodox day school. You love coming to their events, whether it's a Chumash ceremony or a celebration of Israel Independence Day. So it does, in some ways, inspire you and a lot of the work that we do at the foundation.
Well, you make a good point, but it's a peculiar point in the sense that while you're right, I do like some aspects of Orthodoxy, it is so far removed from my world, I don't exactly know how to deal with it. That while I know a considerable number of Orthodox Jews, and I have a tendency to strike up friendships with many Orthodox, somehow, nevertheless, I don't think about it very much when I think about the Jewish future. I think about the secular Jewish world, Jews like me, like my children, like most of the people I went to school with, you know, the Dalton types and the other types. So it's a little bit makes me.
So I think that's that's the laboratory that Ezra was might have been referring to. Some, you know, in, the family laboratory, which is here I am, and my children don't go to Jewish day school and haven't, and meanwhile Sarah's, you know, have gone or are at Ramaz, and it's sort of interesting. It will be an interesting between us anyway to see, you know where the Jewish future lies in this family. You know, that's I don't know if that's what you were getting at, Ezra, or just more broadly, but it's something that, you know, how could you not wonder? How could you not wonder about it?
Yeah, I think the Steinhardts are a lab school. I don't want to get super hung up on the term, but it goes back to the thing that's hung up on the wall, which is I'm an atheist. Thank God. You know, the thank God part of it creeps back in with Michael routinely. And I would just say, I am actually surprised to hear the things you said about the numbers. And I don't know better. I'm not necessarily sure that's 100% right. I would merely observe that if you told me there were no decline, that a non-declining numerator above a steadily declining denominator is going to be an increasingly large percentage over time. And what I was getting back at is in this balance that is constantly a source of both creativity and irritation in Michael. Between, I can't tell you the number of times a conversation of mine has started with Michael in which the following two words come out: you Orthodox. The minute I hear you Orthodox, I kind of get ready for the next, you know, onslaught. By the end of the conversation, it can turn incredibly sweet. And so the irritation, as I say, sometimes turns fairly fairly creative, and I really didn't mean to confine this so much to Orthodoxy, but to God-based Judaism. And so I wonder, as you look at it today, all of you, where are we in this adventure, and how significant is a continued, and I think very likely, if not in the present, but in the future, likely to be an increasingly dominating Orthodox population? How important is that for this process? And to what extent can some of the shortcomings in that world learn from the lab school? It's not to suggest that the Steinhardts have all the answers. It is to suggest that the Steinhardts have a lot of very interesting questions and are willing to really do interesting things about them. And this is just a stop along the journey. I just wonder how it looks at this point.
I mean, one thing I'll say just to the atheism issue is that David Ben-Gurion was an atheist. And so to me, there's no contradiction in being deeply in love with the Jewish people and deeply concerned.
To be sure, but David Ben-Gurion had a real solution to that conundrum. And he did something about it, and he founded the state of Israel. I'm not saying it was all him, but it certainly was a lot him. And I think that's a very, very legitimate answer. It's the same problem, which is, what are the alternatives to a deist-based Judaism? You can turn it into secular Zionism. You can even turn it into religious Zionism, although Lord knows where religious Zionism is going these days. I'm just saying I just wonder what the mix is, and what are the creative parts of the mix, and how those sparks all work.
I think
it's easy to ask the questions. I understand that. I'm just fascinated by it.
I think we all wish we had an answer. Certainly searching for the answer is something that we do. And I think that being inspired by Israel and its creativity and its success is certainly an answer. But I think that the biggest answer hasn't been answered. I think there is an educational something that needs to be created to educate secular American Jews. And I happen to be, like everyone, a fan of Birthright, but you have to realize the limitations of a 10-day trip. And the reality is, my dad is a numbers guy, so everything at the foundation is dominated by numbers. And the Birthright has been studied beautifully by Len Sachs at Brandeis from day one. So you have wonderful data, and you can see that if you go on this 10-day trip, it actually dramatically changes your life, and you are so much more likely to marry someone Jewish. So and at the same time, so there's that side of it. And at the same time, you come back and you don't really know that much. You went to Israel not knowing much, and you come back to America and you still do not know much. So to me, the educational question of how to create some Jewish knowledge and some Jewish confidence and some Jewish pride inside people who already feel pretty good to be Jewish but don't know much is a question that is still outstanding, and I think on a lot of people's minds.
One of the areas that I contribute to, I was about to say, God knows why. God easily slips into my conversations, which is anomalous for an atheist. But one of the areas that I contribute to and have devoted a fair amount of energy to is the ultra-Orthodox community, mostly here, but in Israel as well. Now, here is a community that is God-centric, but is in so many ways weak and constrained and inhibited, and in a certain sense going nowhere. And I think about that group compared with a modern Orthodox like you, Ezra, and I don't know where I wind up, but that community that really needs help by the standard that I would apply is the ultra-Orthodox, and they're not getting it. They're not getting it from the Orthodox, they're not getting it from very many people, and they're not getting it from the governmental aspect of the world that's supposed to commit for people like that to be to have a comparable quality education to
Mhm.
everyone else. So
So it's interesting. I mean, we do sometimes come at things rather differently. I sometimes worry about the precarious future of modern Orthodoxy because I see things that have happened to the left of God-centered Judaism, to the left of modern Orthodoxy and out of Orthodoxy entirely, perhaps coming back into the Orthodox world on the left side in over the next generation or two in ways that aren't necessarily all that terribly constructive or helpful. But you know, this a little bit comes from some of the things you and I've talked about over many years. You've written lately about the shortcomings of secular education in some of in the ultra-Orthodox world, and I think written about it, you know, very interestingly. I wonder what you think can be done to improve education there, and I wonder what you think the flip side of that is. That is, you know, schools after school with, you know, with very, very strong departments in secular education or in secular content and weak on Jewish content. You know, what do you think can be done to make Jewish topics interesting and abiding to those kinds of kids?
Will, you're distinguishing between secular and Jewish. That's not the words I would use.
Sure.
Jewish content is extraordinarily important to the Jewish future of the secular world. And we've got to figure out ways to resonate the Jewish content so that secular Jews feel strongly Jewish. And it ain't easy, And I acknowledge that. Having said that, I think that that's our greatest hope, to somehow, and that's why Birthright seems to impact so many people, while it doesn't so much touch the intellectual quality of a kid's life, it somehow nevertheless, in a peculiar and inarticulate way, touches the Jewish content of their life. But we've got to do a much better job than we're doing now.
Understood. I was using secular and Jewish just to distinguish between, say, Dalton and Ramaz. One is a secular school and is not a Jewish school, and one is a Jewish school. I wasn't trying to distinguish between Jewish schools that are secular and Jewish schools that are religious. One of the things that you told us 2 years ago, I remember David and I talking about it after, just in terms of the numbers, was the figure then 2 years ago that you thought had been expended on Birthright over time was, if I remember it correctly, was something like $2.25 billion. It was about $2.25 billion. If you were the person making those decisions, all of them, and it's a question of resources, how would you allocate resources? What would you invest in this area that you just described as critical in terms of attracting Jewish identity in the world of secular Judaism? Clearly, some of it is a resource issue. It's going to cost money. You were incredibly successful in pulling together the financial resources for Birthright. Do you think that this is an equally attractive challenge to the world of fund givers? Have you given that some thought? I'm just curious what.
Rephrase the question, please, Ezra.
Birthright is incredibly expensive. It took a great deal of money of yours and a great deal of money raising on your part to pay for Birthright and you are very generous in always giving credit to some of the enormous contributors to Birthright. As you turn to the challenge that you just described as particularly critical, that is understanding Jewish pride in the context of a secular education and forming Jewish identity thereby, I wonder how long a time one has to raise money for that, because it might be attractive now, it might be less attractive a generation from now. And I just wonder whether you think that that is an errand that could meet with the same kind of success that Birthright did, or is it not going to be that attractive?
Well, let me get in answer to that question to a part of the book where I try to be, and in retrospect, I feel I wasn't strongly negative enough in describing the Jewish institutional world. I feel that the Jewish institutional world is woebegone in terms of its ability to stimulate Jewishness in the secular world. I think it has to do so much more and has to change so dramatically that in and of itself would be one of my main objectives, i.e. to refocus the non-Orthodox secular institutional world toward an approach that not only enhances Jewishness, but secularity as well.
And I would add, what's interesting about your question is that the thought of raising that money, I think, really depends on the kind of idea that we can create to capture the imagination of those givers. And I would say it's interesting, but we launched Jewish Pride, we launched the book in Israel, and as my family walked off the El Al airplane, they had a question that had been posed to Einstein, and it said, would you rather have all the world's creativity or all the world's knowledge? And he said that for him, the answer was obvious. Knowledge is finite and creativity is infinite. So he would, of course, choose creativity. And my father's the one that has the creativity. And so what's the idea going to be is the big question. So we talk about that. One example that we play around with is a prequel to Birthright, if you will, a 7-day or 10-day experience for American 17 or 18-year-olds in America to teach them everything, because people are so upset about what's going on campuses and the anti-Semitism, but you have to actually ask what we expect an 18 or 19-year-old to do on campus to stand up to anti-Semitism when they know, as my dad would love to say, bupkis, they're ignoramuses, he would say. So what exactly are we hoping for? So the question of the fundraising really gets back to the question of what is the educational intervention we're going to create? And if we could come up with something fabulous that people thought had a shot at giving kids what happened in your house, Ezra, they grew up knowing it. And, as much as our house might be a lab, because David and I went to Dalton and we didn't have much of a religious education and we're both so committed Zionists and Jews, the reality is that none of our families are good examples for what 85% of American Jews look like. They know nothing.
Right.
And the question is, what can we do for those Jews who go to Israel for the first time and feel something during a Birthright trip, but still come back knowing nothing?
Yeah, I totally agree.
Well,
Sorry, Michael, go ahead.
so Sarah captures that well. We have, in part, because of the failures of the Jewish institutional world, so much to try to accomplish, to instill in, we keep using the word secular Jews, or maybe we should use the word
Non-observant.
non-observant
engaged.
or cultural, I'm not sure. But we have to do so much better than we're doing now. And you in the Orthodox world, frankly, are no help. I don't see you, aside from egotistic phenomena that sometimes exist, I don't see you banging down the doors of the secular Jewish world and saying, let me help you become more Jewish. Let me help you love the Jewish aspect of your lives. And somehow we have to do that much, much more and much better.
Well, I mean, I would observe that certain forms of outreach not only dot, but flower the Jewish environment these days. You may not be necessarily terribly satisfied either with the approaches or with the results, but sensitivity toward non-observant Jews is not completely absent from Orthodox Jewish life. I go back to what Sarah said, and that is, and now maybe I'm kicking this up one level more intense than you intended, than the pride of Steinhardt's intended. With the lab school comes, to some extent, a movement and a program, and funding here follows the program, and the program follows funding. If you are seriously enough engaged to put something substantive on the table, you will, I think, attract help, financial help, but also non-financial help from all walks of Jewish life. Because I think some of the problems you identify and perhaps can help solve are prevalent in all walks of Jewish life to a greater or lesser extent. We all are still trying to come to terms with the process of modernity and the process of enlightenment. And it's been 200 years plus old, and we may be closer to the beginning than the end, but we're certainly somewhere in the middle. And given the realities of contemporary life, I can think of almost no segment of Jewish life that isn't afflicted and also challenged in the most constructive ways by that group of problems. It is a little bit more narrow in the best sense in terms of what you present, but what you present, oddly enough, has a universal quality to it. It also has a very particular quality to it. And the trick is to try to make what you present universal enough that you will gather, I think, support and resources. And I don't now mean that as a euphemism for money, although I mean money too, from other sectors in Jewish life. And I think that is largely what Sarah was getting at.
Well,
You may disagree. We have many
no,
times.
I think I do, because when I look back on my life's experience and the various Orthodox outreach types that I have met, they are so Orthodox focused that I don't think they would resonate in the non-Orthodox world. And with the exception of Chabad, which is a story unto itself, I don't think they generally do.
Can I chime in with one thing? I wanted to add this before, but I was thinking about your life, Dad. I don't know if Ezra, do you know who married the rabbi who married my parents almost 55 years ago?
Do
you
I
happen
know
to know that?
who?
Do you happen to know?
I didn't get the question. I'm sorry.
Who was the rabbi who married Michael to my mother, my parents?
No.
It was Shlomo Carlebach. And I think that's interesting. And the reason I think it's interesting is because here my dad is saying he's an atheist, which, okay, we believe that. But one thing, and I think it's sort of something to keep in mind, because I think it's so important. I mean, you disagree if you do, Dad, but spirituality is such an important part of your life, feeling spiritual. And you say you're an atheist, yet Shlomo married you, and he married you because you loved him. You loved his music. His music probably changed your life and woke you up. That, I don't know, maybe I'm not saying it the right way.
No, you make a good point.
B'nai Jeshurun, which, whatever you think of that shul, they have amazing music. When you go there, you're jumping up and down. You have tears in your eyes of joy. How do you, so I think this is just, I just want to make that point because there's something, you know, you're not, you don't observe religiously, and yet you have this deep feeling inside of you that's almost crying out. Like I wish there was a, you know, you could go to experience that BJ music every day or at least once a week, because I know what it means to you. I think it brings a joy to you that is that you don't get in any other way in your life. It's very, very intense and very special, and it's religious. It is, I don't know, I want to say it's religious. It's spiritual. It's something different.
No, those are interesting points. Goes without saying that BJ is not orthodox, but it is spiritual and it has a certain tradition. And from my perspective, if the Jewish world writ large could become awash in BJ spirituality, it would really change a lot, but it doesn't seem to be happening. Sarah, you want to add anything?
No, I would echo certainly that having, you know, David and I laughed that when we were kids and we would get into the car to go anywhere, there was klezmer music. You know, that's a unique ingredient to our lab. But, you know, I would just say that, you know, coming back to really the point of the book and the questions being asked in the book, which is most American Jews don't grow up with all these different ingredients. You know, Ezra, you're certainly saying there's this whole Orthodox ingredient, or there's religion, or there's God, or whatever we want to call it. But, you know, you can grow up in a house like we did without that largely, but with Israel and with, you know, a lot of Jewish identity and a lot of Holocaust information and a lot of Jewish history and a lot of, you know, bar and bat mitzvahs on Masada and a lot of Chabad rabbis in our lives and a lot of other, all sorts of rabbis in our lives all the time. But that's not transferable. So the real question is, what do you do? And I keep punting it out of, you know, you just got to be creative and you have to be willing to spectacularly fail in trying new efforts. You cannot keep beating your head against the wall, doing the same thing over and over again. Mediocre reform or conservative shul, an uninspired sermon, a Hebrew school once or twice a week that your kids dread going to. You know, you just have to think differently.
I think Jacob Gold, our president, wanted to say something or make a point in response to something David said or something Sarah said. So Jacob, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Sarah, your point earlier about you go to Israel for 10 days and you're inspired, but you don't know that much. And David, your point about, you know, your dad and mom being married by Shlomo Carlebach, I think both of you are saying something which is, you know, religion's not all about intellect. So when we accepted the Torah on Mount Sinai, it was Na'aseh v'nishma, that we will do, and then we will understand. But there is you might not like the word spirituality, whatever the word that you're comfortable with, but there is something, there's an emotional connection that people have, you know, when they go on birthright trips, an emotional commitment that they want to marry a Jew, even though they don't have the intellectual knowledge. And I think maybe even what Michael's saying and Ezra, but there has to be some fun and some positive and some energy in Judaism, or it just doesn't work. I mean, you can't just throw intellect at people, and maybe for some, but people want to feel something emotionally. And I think that maybe that's something, Michael, I haven't read your book yet, but maybe that's something that you know, that I think is important, the emotional, spiritual connection, which Michael, it sounds like, I remember, you know, you were involved with funding the Shlomo Carlebach Broadway show, which I heard is coming back. But, you know, there is something to that. So if you guys could expound on that.
Well, as Jacob, I think you probably know, Shlomo Carlebach was in many ways an outsider to the Orthodox world. He was often accused of moral of immorality. He was often accused of doing things that would not be acceptable in the Orthodox world. I was sort of vaguely aware of that at the time, but didn't mean very much to me. I don't know what it might have meant to you if you were around then.
Well, I will say at Fifth Avenue, and Ezra can speak to the history, but, we have Carlebach tunes in our davening, which we didn't have 50 years ago. And I think the Orthodox world, has used his music. And I think a lot of what you're saying is correct, but I think the Jewish world needed that energy and spirituality. So I'm not speaking, I didn't know Shlomo Carlebach, and I've heard wonderful things about him as a human being. But, what you're saying is 100% correct, which was, there was a time it was shunned to have Carlebach tunes in yeshivas or synagogues, and I'll let Ezra respond to that better. But at Fifth Avenue, I can tell you that in the last decade, we have Carlebach tunes. Ezra, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I don't. I was just going to make the same point, so there's no reason to add. But beyond just the shul, one of the really interesting things about Carlebach, and wasn't really aware there was that much of a subject of the Steinhardts, but Shlomo was a sort of a friend of our families. I have a nephew who was working hard on a documentary about him, and he was a very good friend to my wife's family. It is remarkable that, to use a stronger word than Michael used, that the anathema in which Shlomo was held in the Orthodox community toward the end of his career and his life has not kept his music from reaching absolutely every last tributary to any stream or river in Jewish life. There is no place in Orthodox Jewish life in which his music hasn't reached. Some may criticize that, but in the yeshiva world, for example, moving away from the synagogue world, yeshiva world has clearly come to terms with the idea that his music is not only acceptable, but to be embraced. And it's an interesting phenomenon about how that came about and what that suggests about the person. That's in response to Michael's comment about, the things that he was vaguely aware about and paid less attention to.
Jacob, I would comment that from my perspective, which is sort of an unusual perspective because I really am a very secular person. I'm married to an Orthodox man. My kids have gone to Orthodox day school, but are also pretty secular, I would say, which is that sometimes when we're talking at the foundation about what we're trying to build, which is often community, the reality is that if you look inside the Orthodox world, that's one of the greatest strengths within the Orthodox world. It's community. So I understand sort of like, is it the silliness? Is it an irony? Is it the, I'm not sure exactly what the perfect word is of trying to recreate for secular Jews what already exists for Orthodox Jews, what has been left. But the reality is, if you go back to my father's work 20 or 30 years ago when he started Pij, if you handed for free a Jewish education, a day school education to most American Jews and said, your kids can go to this Jewish day school for free, they would say, no, thank you. And that is the reality of where people are. Right. And if you were to convince secular Jews to come to any Orthodox synagogue, they would say, well, how come we're not sitting together? I want to sit next to my spouse. Or I'm gay, and what's the halacha? They wouldn't know that word, but what are the rules about gay people? And there'd be some real problems. And so while on some level, I certainly am deeply inspired by Orthodox life and in part feel part of it and, engaged with it and love it, I also see that if I put my thinking cap on for the future of secular American Jewry, there's some real limitations.
But warmth is a part of it also, Sarah, right? I'm saying if a secular Jew walks into an Orthodox synagogue and they feel that people care about them and they're hospitable, that makes a difference, right? So it's something that we take very seriously. David, did you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I've actually been to your shul and I felt that warmth, and and my father referenced Chabad, and I felt that. I think it's not unimportant at all.
We love Chabad. I love Chabad. I think we're fans.
But Chabad, in my view, is not the future of the Jewish world. Chabad is this peculiar anomaly between a certain variety of orthodoxy and the rest of us. And it achieves remarkable stuff. And it is very, very effective for a vast number of Jews. So I'm not deprecating Chabad, but I don't sense that Chabad has the answers to the Jewish future for the secular world.
But Michael, does it have to be one answer, or can it be a bunch of different strategies and a bunch of different groups? Why does it have to be, this is the answer, that's not the answer? Why can't it be, multiple strategies?
It could be. It could be, but I'm not sure that by the nature of your question, you're obfuscating the issue. And the issue is, what is going to bring the 80 or 85% of non-Orthodox Jews in the world back to their Jewishness?
So Michael, if I could ask you, what do you think the answer, a first draft of that answer is, or might be?
I think that part of it is the sorts of things that we've been trying to do. I mean, Birthright is not exactly profound in many, many respects. Can you see me? Are you okay?
Yeah, Jacob's just.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
But Birthright remarkably was profound in impacting the number of secular Jews who hadn't been influenced by anything else. So I think we have some weak answers, but they're still nebulous and limited.
I'll give some that I think the book references. If every Birthright kid could come back and in most American cities learn some Hebrew, there'd be a place to actually learn decent
Good
Hebrew,
point.
that would go a long way. If, for example, One Table, which has been incredibly successful, this in the next few years plan to reach as 10% of American Jewish kids. That's a Shabbat dinner experience. If we were to double that number to 20%, that would change things. If the finest kids graduating our schools were able to go to Israel and do one-year internships, that would change things. If Israel took it upon itself to invest more in the American Jewish community, sent us more kids for our camps, sent us more teachers so that at public schools in Scarsdale and Great Neck in Los Angeles, kids could learn Hebrew the way they want to learn Spanish. By the way, they want to learn Hebrew. There are not enough teachers to teach them. If at every teaching program that is filled with Jewish kids, you could get a master's in Hebrew language education, you'd have programs filled. So those are just some practical, trying to give you some ideas on top of what it would look like if 20,000 kids in a few years started going during their second semester year, senior year of high school, and spent a week learning what a lot of kids have already, what a lot of day school kids have already learned, but learned some Jewish history, learned how to defend Israel on campus, learned about Israel's history. Those are some real concrete ideas that we're playing around with.
Oh, very much so. Very interesting. I think we sort of have to stop just because we're going to run out of time. Michael, did you want to?
No, I was just about
something?
to say, we're still so early
Sure.
in our efforts.
Well, that's what makes it a lab school, Michael. I mean, the questions are profound. The answers are tentative. So it's a work in progress. But
Right.
the work in progress is fascinating, in part because we don't know where it's going to end up.
True.
We just don't know. It's not given to us to say.
Hmm.
I don't think. At least it isn't given to me to see it all that clear. That's what makes it a fascinating but also very important process to try to understand. I sort of say where I started. I don't think there's any corner of Jewish life in which this concept of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zalazar, we really are cross-collateralized, to use the more Talmudic notion of the word Erevon, isn't totally accepted. There are then questions of how it's applied, and those are hugely important. But the all-embracing concept starts with this notion of, I think, the flip side of Jewish pride, because that's what makes Jewish pride possible. It's a very enabling concept, I think. The problem is you then got to go figure it out. The rest go out and learn, but it's a very enabling process. At any rate, I did very much want to thank David, Sara, and Michael. I thank you personally for years of friendship, and thank you on behalf of the congregation. And just want to ask the rabbi if he wants to add anything in closing.
Yeah, the rabbi said he wasn't going to be able to come back tonight.
Okay.
But Ezra, thank you for organizing this, and
My pleasure.
I hope
Yeah, I have 2 or 3 more hours worth of questions, so at some point we're going to have to see if we can get them.
I think tonight was great, and I hope you can coordinate a Friday night dinner with the Steinhardt family at the 4 of your schedules, which I'm sure is complicated, but we're updating the congregation for a reason, and love to continue this discussion when it works for everyone.
All righty.
Thank you.
David, Sara, and Michael, thank you very much, and our love to Judy, and we'll keep at it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thanks, David. Bye, Sara. Bye, Michael.
Take care.
Bye,
Have
guys.
a good night.